Hi, this is Michael Cohen. I am a senior research fellow at New America Foundation, and I blog at Democracy Arsenal. And as you can see right behind me, I always do this on my blogging heads, my book, Live from the Campaign Trail, which came out last year. And I'm joined by the ever-astute Judah Grunstein.
I'm Judah Grunstein, managing editor of World Politics Review. And Michael and I agree on a lot of stuff. We disagree on some things, but I'm not going to argue with the ever-astute tag. I'm very flattered by it. I love it every time I see it pop up over at Democracy Arsenal.
Well, you've earned it, Judah. I got to tell you, you've earned the ever-astute label. But not on every issue, as you said, do we agree. And I think on the ones where we don't agree, they're pretty significant disagreement.
Well, I'll tell you, the funny thing is, as I said that I love seeing it when it pops up. I realize, often it pops up when you want to seg into something you disagree with me on.
That's right.
So I'm gonna set you up a little bit. We're here to discuss the Afghanistan war and some of the debate that's going on around it. And I thought that it would be interesting to start off first with a broader discussion of some of the shifts in military doctrine and approach that have grown out of the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan.
Sure.
And in particular, the shift to counterinsurgency doctrine, and especially population-centric counterinsurgency doctrine. So I'm going to set you up with that, and I know you've got some feelings about that. It's raised some concerns on your part.
Just a few. I mean, I think the issue. It's one of the big debates that Judah and I have had is I think you did a post about 4 or 5 months ago, maybe it was, or even earlier, in which you sort of made the argument that Cohen represents this sort of progressive, sort of humanistic approach to war fighting, and I sort of reject that notion outright. With basically the argument that war is still war, and counterinsurgency has throughout history been just as violent, if not more violent, than well, I don't say more violent, that's too strong, but has been just as violent as conventional war. Particularly against civilians. And so I think one of the interesting, paradoxes in what's happening in Afghanistan is that we sort of tend to believe this rhetoric about this humanistic counterinsurgency, and we're trying to do it in Afghanistan. We're trying to protect the population versus targeting the enemy. And to my mind, it's one of the reasons why we're destined to fail in fighting counterinsurgency. Because if there's one lesson I think you can make about counterinsurgency through history, it's that it's pretty violent, and it tends to be pretty coercive against civilians.
Well, I remember that point of disagreement because it was at a point where you were questioning the shift towards population-centric as opposed to, for instance, drone strikes against some of the leadership in Al-Qaeda leadership in the frontier tribal areas.
Right.
And I first of all, I think that I really value a lot of the debate that's gone on, and you've driven quite a bit of it in terms of questioning some of the assumptions. And so I don't want to get to give the impression that I think that you're necessarily wrong. But just to me, there was this I don't know if it's an irony or a paradox that suddenly the military command in Iraq and Afghanistan was expressing the kind of sentiment and the kind of human or social science
right.
Concerns about civilians in a war zone, and all of a sudden I was hearing a progressive voice arguing for what they call kinetic operations, targeting leadership and firing missiles. So. To me, I think that, for instance, if 40 years ago, during the height of the protests against the Vietnam War, someone would have told the protesters that the United States military command would be adopting a doctrine that placed protecting the civilian population above the priority of destroying the enemy combatants, for instance, I think they would have been surprised, and that's where it jumped out at me. That said, I do have some misgivings myself about Cohen, and I've expressed them on the World Politics Review blog. For me, the main discomfort that I have with it is that it seems to treat this idea of social cohesion in a very methodical way.
Right.
And to me, social cohesion is such an alchemy that it's almost a mystery about how it forms and how it disintegrates at any given time. We know that we know the risk factors, and we have an idea of what goes into a stable and cohesive society. But I'm not so sure we master the concepts and the practice well enough that we can actually put it in place methodically.
Especially when you're asking, enlisted soldiers to do this. I mean, I was struck by, and I'm sure you've seen this Frontline show that on counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, and it was sort of striking to see, and I've sort of written about this at Democracy Arsenal, but on the one hand, you listen to McChrystal, and you listen to officers, you listen to the guys back in Washington, at the CNAS conference talking about the platitudinous nature of Cohen. We have to protect civilians, we have to, give them a reason to support the government, and then you sort of see the practice of it on the ground, and it's really a frustrated Marine trying to talk to 20 Afghan natives and not having necessarily the facility or the capacity to really understand sort of what their issues are, or to really be able to sort of talk to them in a language that I think both of them kind of understand. And I think that we sort of assume, I mean, there's a weird thing about counterinsurgency, especially when you're asking the guys on the front line sort of act like anthropologists, act like social scientists, which they're not. They're soldiers. And, part of this, their job is to fight America's wars and prosecute America's wars. And there's something very dangerous to me in asking them to do something different than what they are trained to do. And I'm not so sure that it's the right mission to ask for them.
That's one area where I guess I'd push back a little bit, in the sense that if the U.S. Army and the U.S. military really does adopt Cohen as a core concept, then you'll get some training aspects for the soldiers whereby they will be trained in some of in more operational aspects of it. It's true that for now it really is a command level doctrine, but I think that I'm not sure. I agree that obviously the profile of the military recruiting right now might not target the kind of recruits that would be most gifted for that. But that doesn't mean that couldn't change, and the only way for that to happen is if the doctrine becomes a core concept. And I guess I'd say that for me, it's regardless of how it's used, or rather independently, not regardless, but independently of the dangers of how it's used, the idea that the Army would be broadening its profile of the kind of recruits it's looking for, so that they are 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds that are more able to have interpersonal relationship skills that add to the ability of the Army to interact with the civilian population abroad. I think that's good.
I mean, I think it's good. I don't know how realistic I think it is for any 18 or 19-year-old to be have that kind of capacity, at the same time also being a highly trained soldier. I mean, I'm not so sure that I think it's realistic. But look, okay, even if I agree with you about this, and that we should change the training so that we have soldiers who are more socially aware and who can reach out to civilians more effectively, doesn't change the fact that that's not going to happen in Afghanistan. I mean, one of the things that I have found so striking and so frustrating about this debate about counterinsurgency in Afghanistan is that it is like it's really hard to imagine, looking at it from a historical perspective, a worse place for the U.S. to fight a counterinsurgency than Afghanistan. Okay? I mean, the notion that we are going to try to reach out to the population, to use a carrot-based approach, at the same time that we have basically lost the military and political initiative to the Taliban, it just goes against everything we've learned in counterinsurgency history. I mean, the Communistas like to talk about Vietnam as an example of where counterinsurgency worked. Counterinsurgency worked in some measure, but the Viet Cong had completely, wiped themselves out with not only the Tet Offensive, but the offensive that came after that. Counterinsurgency would tends to, and also in Iraq is a better example. I mean, you could argue counterinsurgency methods or the surge or whatever you want how you want to describe it succeeded in large measure because there were significant changes in the population in Iraq that Sunnis recognized their own benefit in going after Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The Sadr militia recognized the benefit in declaring a ceasefire. I mean, there was to some extent by the time of 2007, both sides had bled themselves out a little bit with this constant ethnic cleansing. We do not have that situation in Afghanistan. I mean, I think everybody agrees, from those of us who think this mission is flawed and those people who think we should double down on it, Taliban has regained the initiative. So to my mind, the answer to that, and I'm going to channel my inner John Gentile here, is to regain the military initiative and go after the enemy. But we're not doing that.
Right.
Instead, we're trying to reach out to the population.
I'll push back against that a little bit, and again, part of what I'm doing is playing devil's advocate to try and tease out the debate.
Sure.
But I have to admit that in a lot of ways, I myself am taking this opportunity right now to really question my own assumptions about what has gone on and what is going on in Afghanistan. And one of the things that I've come back to often is some of the things that Joshua Faust has talked about. I know you had a Blogging Heads discussion with him recently.
Right.
He's contributed to World Politics Review quite a bit. And in particular, he did a feature article for us where he examined one particular district in Afghanistan, Kapiza, and he showed that in fact counterinsurgency in Afghanistan can work. It's just that it's never been resourced enough to the point where you can get to that hold and build phase. It's always the cleared worked, the hold and the sort of beginning of reconstruction elements worked, and then there just weren't enough boots on the ground, and so the soldiers had to leave, and that's when the Taliban sort of infiltrated back in. I'll say another point.
Okay, because you have to respond to that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, and the other point that I'd make is that again, not being an expert in terms of on the ground in Afghanistan, I don't speak the language. I've never been there, so I'm dependent as much as most of us are on the experts and on people who are doing some of the on the ground analysis. I just read an interesting analysis on the part of John McCreary from Night Watch, who's an intelligence analyst, and he was analyzing some of the violence and combat reports, and he was arguing that in some ways the insurgency is contained within the Pashtun areas and of the south, but also within Pashtun grouplets in the north. But that outside of that, it's relatively contained.
Right.
So again, I'm playing the advocate because I find myself, as much as I have my long-term doubts and as much as I think the strategic argument has been very confused recently, but I wonder, there's something very tempting, I think, about the certainty of some of the military guys who are saying, look, give us the resources. We're pretty confident about this model, about how it will work, and we'd like to put it in place and try. And the fact is, we really haven't over the past 8 years in Afghanistan.
Well, you're never going to get enough troops. You're never going to get enough American troops, and I think we can talk about this later, but you're never going to get enough NATO troops. I mean, if we do the kind of mission you're talking about, you might get, let's say you get 40,000 American troops, which, by the way, is not even enough to do a counterinsurgency, okay? Let's say you get that. You're talking about at least a year probably before all those troops are in place. And then you run into the winter, and so you're not going to see maybe serious fighting until possibly 2011. Okay? And then they're going to say, well, we need a year, 18 months to figure this out. So then you're basically committing 2 or 3 years with these number of troops trying to turn things around. What happens with NATO? Is NATO going to be around for 2 or 3 more years? You know this better than I do, but I seriously doubt it. And so I think to some extent, it's not what you're describing is all well and good, but it's not realistic, I don't think. And especially if you don't have the support of the Afghan government, which we don't have. We don't have, and we're not going to get that anytime soon. So my argument, to go back to what you were just saying, is, and this is sort of actually a little frustration. I mean, there's an article up today by Stephen Biddle in New Republic, who I've jousted with on the blog a few times, and he sort of goes through all the different ideas people have talked about and says why they're all not going to work and we have to do Cohen. What doesn't go mentioned in his piece, and maybe it wasn't, I didn't look more closely, but I didn't see it at least, is the idea that we need to prioritize how we fight this war. The idea that we're going to go into Helmand, that we're going to go into the Pashtun Belt, and we're going to out-governance the Taliban, especially when the Taliban have easy access to a safe haven across the Duran line in Pakistan, to me is a crazy idea. And the goal should be, let's not fight the enemy in the places where they have the military initiative. Let's focus on the areas in the north and in the west where the Taliban is making inroads, and let's consolidate these gains, and not necessarily try to fight a war in a place where we do not have the advantage and not have the initiative, and we don't. So I think part of the frustration of the counterinsurgency argument a little bit is that it's being misapplied. I mean, there are places where we should be doing more counterinsurgency sort of Taliban-esque policies.
Right.
But I don't think that's the case in Helmand. I don't think it's the case in the Pashtun Belt, where the Taliban is relatively popular in some places. So I think that's part of the disconnect also.
I think that Afghanistan is a very challenging terrain for any kind of war to begin with, but especially for this new counterinsurgency doctrine. The question is, do you stick in the cities, which are, with the exception of Kandahar, are not necessarily that contested, or do you go out into the villages and the mountains, which we've tried and doesn't seem to be working?
Right.
I think though that what's happened in a lot of ways in Afghanistan over the last couple of years is that I don't think it's accurate to say we haven't necessarily tried Cohen or counterinsurgency. I think what happened is that following what I want to put it in quotation marks, the success of the surge in Iraq. What happened was this rush to sort of migrate these techniques to Afghanistan, and probably the most dangerous of those was trying to migrate the force protection measures from Iraq into Afghanistan. The fact is, David Kilcullen calls counterinsurgency armed social work.
Right.
And, having worked in social work myself, both with adult populations and with adolescent gangbangers in Watsonville, California, I can tell you that when you're doing social work, you often have the temptation and a voice saying, I just wish that I had an army brigade to force these people to do what I know is better for them.
Right, sure.
Right? And so then, of course, you get that. You take a step back and you say, wow, that's a really pretty arrogant way to approach this. And it's also very unrealistic. On the other hand, there's also an element to counterinsurgency which has struck me is similar to the idea of neighborhood policing. It's a very strong, heavy police work to a degree. And I think what happened over the last couple of years was this idea of in Iraq, it was police, community police in a patrol car.
Right.
By which I mean the Humvees, the armored Humvees, and things like that. And in Afghanistan, I think what's becoming clear is that what's really needed is the beat cop on foot in the neighborhood.
But that needs to be an Afghan,
and
the Afghan police, as we all know, are corrupt and terrible. So you're right to some extent. I don't disagree with you.
Well, and so then let's I guess get into the policy review that's going on now, because we had this sort of this moment last March where President Obama and the administration rolled out the Afghanistan-Pakistan strategy.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And since then, we've had 2 or 3 other strategy reviews, at least 2 that I can think of, Petraeus's and McChrystal's. Now, I remember at the time of the initial rollout thinking, this is a really pretty skillful political formulation right here, because at the time I found myself in agreement with Max Boot. Now, without any judgment or any sense of judgment, value judgment, that's just a very rare occurrence that I'm expressing the same thing that Max Boot is. And I remember writing about that at the time, saying, when you have 2 people as normally in disagreement as myself and Max Boot in agreement on something, it means either one of us is really misunderstanding it, or it's a political expression that's so vague that everyone can find what they want
onto it and find what they want to find out of it.
Yeah. Now, at the time, what I sort of took out of it was that having put 20,000 more troops, 17,000 combat troops, and 4,000 more trainers in Afghanistan, and then also some of the more opaque troop transfers that we've since learned about. My sense was Obama had shown strength. He was going to hold ground for as long as it was necessary, and then he was going to say, look, we tried, it didn't work, we're going to pull out now.
Which is kind of the impulse that I had. I thought it was a great sort of, this is like, let's declare victory and go home. This was based on the policy he was announcing, in my view, in March. I think we were on the same page with that.
And you immediately expressed some reservations about the sort of backdoor that had been left open, or the porch door that had been left open, with the counterinsurgency approach to the counterterrorism strategy.
Well,
and in the meantime, I think that McChrystal's strategic review, which comes back, and in all fairness, we shouldn't really know about yet, but we do,
Right, yeah,
has come back asking for more troops. And all of a sudden, Obama has sticker shock. I'm thinking, well, that wasn't really what I expected to happen. So the question being, and now we're back to basic assumptions. So where do you come down in terms of the debate about what is the strategic importance in Afghanistan right now?
Well, I think this is the interesting. That is the ultimate question, right? And I think it's what I find interesting is that you go back to March, right, and you read the president's speech, and I've quoted the speech ad nauseum over the past, I think, 7 months, but basically saying the goal is to disrupt, defeat, and dismantle Al Qaeda, and that to me signaled a very focused counterterrorism. I mean, he didn't mention, for example, in the speech the words counterinsurgency. It was never referenced in his speech. It was referenced in the white paper review, but never in the speech
Right.
itself. And what's happened since then is that mission has really just developed into something much deeper and much bigger, which is basically how do we prevent the Taliban from taking power in Afghanistan. And to my mind, that's why I started writing the Afghanistan Mission Creep Watch, because I said this is something that we're not going to be able to achieve effectively, and something that we're not going to be able to that shouldn't be our focus there. Our focus needs to be on basically getting rid of Al Qaeda, which for the most part in Afghanistan we've done, and rather successfully. So from the strategic standpoint, I think I'm very dubious about what we can accomplish and what we should be trying to accomplish in Afghanistan. But I think to some extent, and this may sound like an odd thing to say, but the issue of strategy has to be twinned pretty closely with what our capabilities are. And one of the problems I've had with this debate to some extent is that I keep reading people saying, we need to train 400,000 Afghan soldiers. We need to, extend the writ of the Afghan government, which is what McChrystal said. We need to protect the population. All these things that we need, that if you look at the reality of what's happening in Afghanistan, simply aren't possible. And simply aren't. We don't have the support from the Afghan government. We don't have enough troops to do it. We don't have the support. We don't have enough civilians on the ground to do it. And there has to be a recognition, that the capacity doesn't exist from a tactical standpoint. And then also, I think, and this is the most important part from a political standpoint, I've been spending a lot of time recently researching counterinsurgencies. And if there's one sort of takeaway, it's that no matter how successful you are militarily on the ground, that the politics of Cohen the politics of trying to fight a counterinsurgency tends to overwhelm your military objectives. And the French and Algeria is a good example of that, actually, where militarily they're pretty successful in defeating the insurgency, but politically, ultimately, they were forced to disengage and grant independence to the Algerians. So I think that you need to, before you devise a strategy, you have to recognize what are your capabilities, what can you accomplish to some extent.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
I agree with that. I mean, I think that, for instance, I'm both. I have sort of a double nature of engineer and artist. So the engineer part of me really is tempted by the military approach to counterinsurgency.
Sure.
The social scientist in me is saying, wait a minute, everything I've heard about the Karzai government, everything I've heard about the way in which corruption is an endemic problem over there. And it ripples outward. The political difficulties ripple outward within the region, with Pakistan's involvement. With we'll be running a briefing tomorrow, actually, on India and Afghanistan. So I agree. There's an enormous disconnect in some ways between what the military guys are trying to sort of salvage in terms of resources, and even what they themselves are saying about the fact that the solution over there is political and ultimately and not military. Agreed also on the shortcomings in terms of any plans to Afghanize the security forces over there.
But Judith,
I guess the question I have, and this is where again I myself am really sort of soul searching on the question is I think that it's very easy, especially in America, which is essentially in strategic terms an island. Okay, we don't worry about Canada. We worry maybe about some drug gangs in Mexico,
Right.
but that's about it. And our other two frontiers are oceans. Okay, so really, when we discuss real vital national security interests, what really existentially threatens America?
Well,
Nothing at this point.
I mean, that's a bigger
Okay,
issue,
so-
and I'd love to talk about it because my answer to that and is not much. I mean,
No, nothing. Yeah, there's
you
really
know-
nothing that does. I mean, some stray nukes or a false launch from Russia, maybe. But besides that, there's nothing really where we can say this is going to threaten America existentially. But just pulling back a little bit and then dialing it back into Afghanistan, we are, however, still the predominant global power. And with that does come certain responsibilities. And I guess in some ways I'm a little influenced in this in terms of by editing Thomas P.M. Barnett's column every week, where he's saying, look, you have this sort of multi-generational expansion of a global order, a global trade order, an integration of the world into a global economy, and that what you have with that is whether or not the initial hopes and desires for human rights and for political liberalization to follow trade liberalization. What you have is an enormous expansion of a certain rule set.
Yeah.
And that the United States still, for now, maybe 50 years from now it'll be China, maybe it'll be China and America, or an integrated Asia and an integrated Europe. We don't know. But for right now, America really still does have this responsibility to step up and do as much as it possibly can to maintain these global commons and the security and stability of them.
Okay,
and
I agree. That's a very
and Afghanistan is a pretty big missing piece right now.
Look, I agree to that extent, but this sort of gets to my whole argument about sort of the myth of American omnipotence. You know, this notion that we can go into places like Afghanistan or Iraq or elsewhere and at least militarily turn these places around and improve sort of global security by stabilizing these countries. And I think what we've seen over the past 8 years is that America is not quite as powerful as we think we are, and there are limitations in our power, limitations in our effectiveness. And in some ways, it's funny. I mean, it's sort of bizarre to me to watch some of the sort of neoconservatives talk about Afghanistan and sort of bemoan or urge the president to ignore public opinion. I mean, part of the reason that there is such that the public is so, I think, opposed to Afghanistan or is growing in opposition to it because they're sick and tired of war. They're sick and tired of a war in Iraq that we shouldn't have fought in the first place. And in a sense, chickens are coming home to roost as far as I think the political fallout from these constant U.S. military interventions overseas. I mean, I think that, and this goes back to a larger issue that we tend in this country to define our strategic interests and challenges through a strictly military prism. And we get attacked on 9/11, 3,000 Americans get killed, and our response is we go and invade and occupy two Arab countries or two Muslim countries. I mean, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't respond militarily when we're attacked, but the disproportionate nature of that response to the threat we actually face is extraordinary. I mean, I always go back to this argument, and here in the States, we're arguing about spending $1 trillion on fixing the healthcare system and giving every American health care. 20,000 Americans die every year who don't have health insurance coverage. Since 9/11, that's maybe 160,000 have died. No sense of crisis over that. No sense that this is a big national problem. I mean, there is now, but for the last 8 years, what dominated was the war on terrorism. And if you think about it, the amount of money we're spending versus the threat that we face, it's astounding. It's an astounding waste of resources and money. And when you compare it to the challenges that we face at home, and also just overseas as well. I mean, I think that if you look at what the defining elements of the past 8 years of American foreign policy, or just international relations in general, I'm gonna go on a limb here and say 30, 40, 50 years from now, in the great trends of sort of global relations, 9/11 and the war on terrorism will be a blip. And what's much more important is sort of the ongoing spate of sort of globalization and global economic integration, and hopefully continued political liberalization. These are actually great, very important trends that we should be focusing on our foreign policy, not what's happening in a corner of the world in South Asia that has a narrow impact on American national security. And I think that part.
Well,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, and I think on this, I think we are probably more in agreement or mainly in agreement. I think, if I recall correctly, the first blog exchange we had actually was because I had written something, and you had sort of you sort of commented on it within the context of the militarization of foreign policy.
Right, exactly. That's right. Yeah.
And that's been a theme that I've been struck by for quite a while now. The way in which the CENTCOM commander has basically become the American viceroy in the Middle East and some of the Central Asian countries. So I think we're mainly in agreement there, and to the credit of Secretary of Defense Bob Gates and others in the military, there is a lot of talk now about resourcing diplomacy.
Wait a minute.
So that
wait a minute. I got to push back on that. That's not. See, that this is the part of the problem. Okay, so so Gates has said.
I thought there was a dog crisis going on, but it's actually a debate crisis.
Yeah.
Okay, push back.
No. I mean, seriously, Gates has said this, right? We need to put more money into civilian capacity, but his argument is all based on building up civilian capacity to support U.S. military actions overseas. I mean, I'm not hearing Gates say that we need to create a very strong AID so they can go around the world in non-kinetic environments and do development work. I'm not hearing that we need to spend billions more dollars on promoting democracy and building institutions in marginal democratic states. That's not what he's saying, or any of the Cohen institutions are saying. What they're saying is
I agree with you. Okay. I mean, not only that, it could be perceived as even more insidious in the sense that AFRICOM is using a lot of soft power projects and institution building, but it's through a security prism. It's through a national security prism.
We communicate with the world more often than not via the U.S. military than we do via diplomats and via development workers. And in fact, when we do often with development, it's usually through contractors and not through AID government officials. So.
I mean, I agree with you on that. I mean, I guess the fact is, though, again, here I think we're mainly in agreement. So it's hard for me to pick bits and pieces. I think if there is just something that I'm not comfortable doing, and I'm not saying that you are, I'll let you respond. It's that I think that when we get into these sort of heated periods of debate. I get the feeling that oftentimes what we do is that we don't acknowledge the amount of uncertainty in our own and in all the arguments, really, and we also don't acknowledge some of the strong points in the other arguments, and to the extent that it's true, healthcare is a national crisis. It's outrageous. And living as I do in France, where the military is not as resourced as it is in America, healthcare is, and you see, I mean, French diplomacy is one of the strongest national resources, or rather international resources that this country has. Right. You very rarely, shall I say, see military envoys conducting diplomacy for France. So agreed on that. At the same time, there's really no way of comparing this sort of slow, insidious, daily grind that ends up in deaths due to lack of health care with the kind of dramatic event that was 9/11 or even the London attacks or Madrid, and the fact that in international relations, not within domestic government, but in international relations, among the essential functions of the state and of the nation is to defend its citizens. So. And in that to that extent, there is a military angle of that.
Of course. I'm not disagreeing with that.
Yeah,
there's a military angle. I absolutely agree with that. Sure. And I think, and I think, but here's the problem: is that military angle gets abused so easily. I mean, everyone I think would have agreed in this country that after 9/11, the U.S. had a responsibility to respond against Al Qaeda, against the Taliban in Afghanistan, and we did. And I think most people were in support of that. I mean, the problem is that we then, took that attack as an excuse to then go wage war elsewhere, to go wage war in Iraq, a war that we absolutely did not need to fight and has, been an incredible drain on American resources and on American credibility, and of course, in the tragic loss of more than 4,000 American lives. So, no disagreement there. The problem is how that, the response to 9/11 should have involved the military response in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but it should have involved probably a law enforcement response to terrorism. That probably is the most appropriate response to it, not this over-militarized response to it, which we are continuing. I mean, we continue to define the threat from al-Qaeda and the threat from the Taliban, which is not really a threat at all to the U.S., in direct terms. We continue to define these things as military challenges as opposed to political or legal or economic challenges. And that's really where the problem lies to some extent, is that we seem incapable of getting out of this mindset of viewing everything through the prism of the military.
Well, I'm not sure whether it's that we're incapable, but I would say that it definitely demonstrates the degree to which the debate has, and even the strategic considerations have been poisoned by the initial response.
Of course, yes.
To the extent that right now, again, we're calling it Obama's war. He's saddled with trying to really salvage a situation that, I think in all honesty, I've yet to really see an approach that checks off all the boxes. Okay, so we had a little technical difficulty. We're
technical problem there, yeah. Transatlantic call and all these things are gonna happen.
We're gonna hope that the Blogging Heads technical team manages to straighten it out.
Exactly.
It gives us a little chance though to dial it back in, because we're getting a little away from Afghanistan in terms of the militarization of American foreign policy, which is a pretty broad subject and an important one. I know also that you had some pretty, just dialing it back into the strategic interest that we might have in Afghanistan. So you seem to be less convinced about this sort of broader historical responsibility that we might have to help extend the global order of international global order and governance, and integrating non-governed spaces into the multilateral rule set.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the end, I guess what I come down to a little bit is that I feel that, the U.S. needs to be a leader, whatever those words mean. I mean, they need to be pushing, I think, a global agenda. And I think because we are seen in a positive light, at least, since January 20th, more positive light than we had before, I think we have that ability to do so. And I think on a number of multilateral issues, we can and should be a force for good, and climate change is one issue that comes to mind as an example. I just tend to think that we sort of downplay the importance of those elements and tend to overplay the elements of how we use our military to sort of further those goals. And I guess one of my concerns that I keep coming to in Afghanistan is I feel like if we get involved in a long-term conflict there, in a prolonged conflict, we're going to end up, I think, not focusing on areas where we can really make a positive difference on some of these global, transnational issues. And that's what I think part of what happened with Iraq. I mean, I think we sort of forget about that a little bit, is that it wasn't just that we sort of fought this war unnecessarily for 6 years in Iraq. It's that we also distracted attention away and frayed relations with our allies on issues of cooperation, issues where we could have actually moved forward. I mean, just one example is even looking at the global trade talks that didn't actually go forward.
That gives us, I guess, a chance to talk about the difference in the way the Afghanistan war is perceived in America as opposed to here in Europe. One thing, I guess, one thing that I had the most hope about when Obama took office and when we started hearing the sort of whispers coming out about how he was approaching the issue was this idea of a regional approach. Of really approaching the issue more broadly than just the war within the frontiers of Afghanistan, and I guess if I'm most concerned about the impact and the implications of us failing in Afghanistan, it's that I think it will put off for at least a generation. Again, it's hard to predict, but it'll put off at least for the time being the potential and the possibility of really bringing in. The regional, the neighbors, Afghanistan's neighbors, the regional powers, the global powers, into really firming up and stabilizing that part of the world. And one of the advantages, I think, that, for instance, the United States has as opposed to the Soviet Union 20 years ago, is that, or 30 years ago, is that we are not facing global rivals that are trying to undercut us in Afghanistan. And I guess if I'm most disappointed, it's that I think that in some ways the Obama administration didn't aim broadly enough. I think that there should have been some sort of regional summit between all of Afghanistan's neighbors, China, Russia, and the European allies, to really say, look, we can't do this alone, and maybe we might be willing to provide more resources of a military nature if we get a lot more commitment from everyone else on all the other very important things that need to be done. And so I guess as much as I would have liked this sort of return to basic assumptions that we're seeing now, I would have liked to have seen that carried out back in March. If it could have one advantage or one positive impact, it might be making people in some of the capitals around the world sweat a little bit, thinking about what the implications are if the United States really does lose heart and pull out of Afghanistan before the job is done.
But here's the thing. I mean, shouldn't U.S. behavior then be predicated on the attitudes of our allies? I mean, to unpack what you said a little bit there,
sure.
The attitude seems to be how they're going to respond to what we do there. But what's not being taken into account here, I think, enough, is that we have allies who have very diminishing support for this mission in Afghanistan.
Absolutely.
And you go back to the original point that you were making about we should have brought all these groups together. If we had done that, and I agree with you, we should have done that, we would have found that there wasn't the kind of broad-based support for this mission that we're trying to do in Afghanistan.
Right.
And so, my fear, and I think this is my fear that and this is exactly my fear before the Iraq War, was that what would end up happening is that we would move forward with this military intervention, and we would not have broad support from our allies, and over time would end up in a situation where we were holding the bag. That's what happened in Iraq, and it's what I think is going to happen in Afghanistan. Because you're seeing already the Canadians are talking about getting out. And I think it's only a matter of time before you see other European countries do the same. The notion that we have 2 or 3 years to do this and we're going to get support from NATO, I think is a pipe dream.
Well, I agree. I agree 100%. Not only that, the urgency of the debate in the United States right now, at least as I experience it through the media, is completely way out of proportion to the lack of attention it gets, or not out of proportion, but is completely disconnected from the lack of attention it gets here in Europe. I mean, the times when Afghanistan makes it into the debate in Europe is when there's a momentary catastrophe, when there's a battle in which a European nation loses troops or suffers casualties. Besides that, no one is talking about it here. It's not on the radar. It's not in the press. The only time it makes the press is if there's an event. It is in the coverage of the American debate. But that said, I agree with you. I think you mentioned previously, and I agree that in some ways, whatever temptation I might have in terms of the possibilities of success are very much tempered by the fact that I think it's a hard, if not impossible, political sell in the United States. In France, for instance, 65% of the population was opposed to an escalation in troops in 2007 when President Sarkozy sent 700 more troops. Now, 700 doesn't seem like a lot, but if you go by per capita or GDP or even comparable military budgets, for the French, it's quite a bit of their capacity, of their deployable forces. So. The fact being that in Europe, political leadership has already taken enormously unpopular measures that so far have not come with any political costs. I guess,
and that's not going to last forever. I'm assuming. I mean, I think at some point the European countries are going to say this isn't worth the political price they're having to pay. And I think it's weird. I mean, think about this also. The Europeans have been, if you think of it since 9/11, it's London and Madrid that have been hit since then. In some ways, you could argue they have a more direct threat from Al-Qaeda and from terrorism than we do. And certainly with large minority, Muslim populations, they've got even, a fertile recruiting pool to work with. and yet they don't seem to feel the same risk that we feel from Al-Qaeda and from terrorism. And I think that, again, goes back to my earlier point about how we tend to view international challenges. I mean, I think also, obviously for European countries, there are greater risks in intervening in Muslim countries than maybe there is in the U.S., and they sort of feel it more domestically than we do. But that real diversion there is I think sort of fascinating to me, and I think it speaks again to the fact that we tend to overemphasize things, and we see everything through the prism of national security, the prism of our military. And I tell you something else, by the way. I mean, I give the Europeans a lot of, one thing that's interesting was with the awarding of the Nobel Prize. I thought it was a very interesting sign from the Europeans that some people perceive it as saying we don't want you to get deeper in Afghanistan. I saw it more as we want you to go back to being a leader. We want you to go back to actually playing a more active role, a more cooperative role, right. Which is what Obama's administration has sort of signaled. I mean, I think the lesson we need to take away from Iraq and Afghanistan is that the world sort of wants America to lead, but they want it to lead in a way that brings a lot of voices to the table. It isn't just America says do this, and everyone has to follow. If you don't follow, then you're somehow against us. Well, but I think on this issue, on the Nobel issue, you and I had a little bit of disagreement about this one.
Well, I think that it certainly it obviously reflects the way in which President Obama and what he represents is perceived here in Europe. It's an easy laugh line here in France, in Paris these days, to say things have changed. It's Obama now. And the mood has definitely shifted with regard to how America is perceived. There's a greater openness. There's a sense of, I forgot, America is America. It's not George W. Bush.
Right.
So without question. Now, on the other hand, on the merits, I think it's pretty obvious, too, that when it comes down to it in terms of accomplishments, he hasn't accomplished what you expect someone to accomplish to get that particular prize, although perhaps historically it's also been used to signal support for an ongoing project of some sort. I guess what's interesting to me is that Obama has this enormous political capital. He's had it since the campaign here in Europe.
Right.
The day of the election, it was a tangible emotional event here, not just for the expatriate community, but it was just a very emotional outpouring of support for what it means in terms of America's history, in terms of this person. He's a remarkably charismatic guy, there's no doubt.
Right. Sure.
And so again, the Nobel Prize is confirmation of that. I guess what's interesting to me, and sort of pivoting on this to talk about something that Stephen Walt just raised on his blog, is essentially he hasn't been able to sort of capitalize on that capital or to transform that capital into getting concrete policy objectives or even steps towards policy objectives. And when you talk about Afghanistan, the first one being the April summit in the April NATO summit, where I think he really did expect to go and say, look, things have changed. We still have a job to finish there, though. So pony up. We need some help. And then once we get this job accomplished, we'll think it through the next time a little more clearly. He didn't get that, and I think that to me this sort of gap between his political capital and the accomplishments. But that's my point. I mean, he's selling a policy that nobody wants to buy. I mean, look, he went to Berlin last year, right, and gave that huge speech in Berlin. In part, I saw it as a way not just to burnish his credentials politically, but also to sort of say to the Europeans, if I win, I'm going to need your support, especially in Afghanistan. Yeah. And how many times can the Europeans say no on this issue before it cuts through the administration? At the time of that speech, I said this is his tough love approach. I'm going to need troops in Afghanistan, and they're not going to give them to him. So I agree with you. At the same time, I would say two things. First of all, I think it's incredibly problematic, and I want to say irresponsible. This part of me that's tempted by the need to succeed in Afghanistan wants to say it's irresponsible of the European allies to take the position they're taking on Afghanistan, because the fact is they can do more, and the political costs won't be that significant. They've already gone against public opinion already. They can do more, and they haven't. I think Obama is absolutely correct to reconsider and to say, look, we can't do it alone. I asked for help. I didn't get it. That changes the the perspective on things. So I agree in the way he's handling it. But to me, there's a question of what costs does he have to make that decision, the European allies pay for that decision, because he wanted the troops. He didn't get them.
Yeah, he wanted the troops, but again, and this is maybe we disagree about this. I think he's got bigger fish to fry than this, and I think that if the Europeans are continuously saying to him, and this has been, I mean, again, a consistent argument, I think, since last year, we don't want to send more troops, and I think, if, for example, he goes along with McChrystal's suggestions and sends the middle option, which is 40,000 more troops, I don't think you're going to see support among the Europeans for that. Maybe on the British, who I think are looking for some kind of political cover, but I think in general you're not going to see support for it. That has
when you say support, what do you mean? It won't be applauded, or it won't be?
I don't think it'll mean. I think it'll open up the floodgates, and they'll send, and the NATO allies will send more troops. I think if you see a 2 or 3 year more commitment from the U.S., you're probably going to see in that period some of the NATO countries begin to back away from the mission, and that has to factor into the president's mindset. I mean, I think what's sort of striking to me at the Afghanistan debate and listening to some of the pro-intervention forces and the pro-escalation forces in this country is that they seem to ignore those kind of political realities. Right. They ignore the political reality that only 1 in 5 Democrats supports the war in Afghanistan, which has got to be a consideration for the president. Right. So I think that these kind of it's sort of weird. One of the weird things about Cohen, to go full circle in this conversation,
sure.
is that those kind of political considerations that are crucial to actually how you wage a counterinsurgency just seem to be glossed over in this debate. I mean, I was always struck by this during the Bush administration that when Cheney, for example, would say, as public support is opposed to the intervention in Iraq or opposed to the surge, and he'd say, so what? I mean, they just didn't care. They just saw this as not something that they had to suddenly factor into the debate. But I think, how public opinion plays out and what the political sort of mindset of the country is toward these kind of conflicts, and even of the allies, is crucially important. In fact, in some ways, it's actually as important as anything else, because if you don't have that kind of political support, you're not going to succeed in the mission.
Well, I would push back on one thing you said in terms of Europe's response. I think that if he did go with whether it's the 40,000, I've heard more that it's probably going to be more along the lines of 15, 20. But I think, for instance, that one political reaction here among the leadership is, okay, he's committed and he's strong. He's going against public opinion. He's going to do something that might not be very popular. That tends to get some respect, I think, from political leadership and allies. I think also if it does have, and this is something we didn't talk about and we won't have time to, if it does have positive impact on the situation in Afghanistan, that obviously makes it easier for the Europeans to extend their commitment, if not increase it. And I guess the last thing, again, agreed. In terms of Cohen and Afghanistan, we hear all about unity of command, unity of effort, etc. And NATO has shown anything but across the board in Afghanistan. So I think without question, it's demonstrated that as an alliance, it might not be the greatest tool for this kind of long-term commitment that's necessary for the kind of mission that's being proposed.
I don't think McChrystal helped things when he's so almost embarrassed. I mean, the German bombing in Kunduz that happened, I guess, a month or so ago, which killed a number of civilians. I mean, I thought some of the criticisms of the German, I need to see more of the details on it, but I think that didn't probably help the NATO relationship to have him doing that. Well, to have him so openly criticizing them.
One of the things that I've noticed and that's been most interesting to me about the Afghanistan war in particular, and for the American Army and military, it's Iraq and Afghanistan, is that Afghanistan has militarized the European armed forces. They don't talk about it in the press about it being war, but the Joint Chiefs in Europe are much more comfortable and back on a war footing than they were previously. And at the same time,
they can be just like America. Then that's great.
Well, in a sense, it's Europeanized the American military approach, in the sense that Cohen is a much more political approach. It's a heavy gendarmerie approach as opposed to a heavy kinetic approach, and that's always been the European military strength, is that sort of peacekeeping and stabilization approach. So a lot of interesting paradoxes and ironies
and I think
going on.
You could argue in some respects that much of counterinsurgency doctrine is based on what the British did in Malaya and Kenya and what the French did in Algeria.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of influence there. I think the problem, again, I'm going to come back to the initial argument here to some extent, is that what a lot of those that focus on, I mean, for example, in FM 324 with the Army counterinsurgency, Marine counterinsurgency manual, they reference those three. They reference Kenya, they reference Malaya, and Algeria as good examples of how you do population-centered counterinsurgency. The problem is what they don't mention in each of those examples is that in each of those three places, there was a heavy level of violence and coercion against the civilian population.
Yeah.
And in a sense, why those missions succeeded is because the military force, the British or the French, was able to separate forcefully the population from the insurgents. We're not willing to do that in Afghanistan for good reason, by the way. I'm not just saying we should.
Sure. You know, I can wrap up my thoughts on the question. We have these models for counterinsurgency, which are obviously colonial models. I don't necessarily think that the United States is on an imperial mission or project or a colonial project. At the same time, I think this, especially the Afghanistan war, is almost a colonial project to the service of global order. It's not in the service of an American empire or to colonize Afghanistan for America, but to bring it within this rule set. So it's this form of it's almost like a multilateral global government form of colonialism. And I guess the question really arises whether that's the mission that we should be assuming for ourselves, whether the military is the way to approach it. And I guess for me, getting back to my own personal approach to it, the engineer in me is tempted by it, and the social scientist in me says, every effort to impose or to integrate absolute order goes against nature. There's always disorder. There's always the element that escapes control. And that's the great beauty of human history is for that reason, because some of the great progress that's happened in human history has come from those zones that have escaped control of the order of the time. So I guess that's
Sure.
how I'd sort of summarize or sum up the way in which I'm very torn right now in terms of where the debate is going, and I've long been against escalation and for a gradual drawdown, and right now I find myself soul searching in terms of basic assumptions again.
But I think the point you make is an interesting one, because talk about this sort of search for order. I mean, I think there's a level of truth to that. I mean, I sort of tend to agree a little bit, but I think it's sort of one of the downsides of American exceptionalism. I mean, this notion that we have the ability to impose that order. Mm-hmm. I mean, or that other countries share our values and share our sort of what we believe to be our universal aspirations. I mean, I obviously believe that sort of there's certain universal human values and human rights. It doesn't mean necessarily that those when it comes to sort of implementing that, doesn't mean it necessarily works that way. I don't think in Iraq there was George Bush talked a lot about the sort of universal belief in democracy and living in peace. Well, that wasn't necessarily the view of all Iraqis in during the war, and certainly isn't the view of all Afghans today. I mean, I think that we tend to view this stuff through sort of the wrong lens, and to tend to view it through the notion that somehow people want to be like us, or that we somehow can convince people that they want to be more like us. It doesn't work that way. And it's a hard lesson, I think, and one that Americans have seemingly had a hard time learning, American policymakers. And I guess to go back a little bit to what I was saying earlier, I mean, part of what good leadership is sort of is weighing those costs and benefits. I mean, I think one thing we failed to do as a country is we really failed to think about how do you balance what our aspirations are on the international stage, what our capabilities are. And you're seeing, I think, that you saw that in Iraq. I think you're seeing that in Afghanistan today.
Right.
And I think that's the number one. I honestly think the number one issue for Obama to deal with, in some extent. He said during the campaign he wants to change the mindset that got us in Iraq in the first place. And to my mind, the mindset that got us in there was the belief that there are no limitations in American power, and that this notion of American omnipotence, that we can, affect change in positive ways around the world. And there has to be a recognition at some point that we need to figure out what we can achieve, and then try to do that, as opposed to trying to sort of lay out this huge agenda or huge mission as we're doing in Afghanistan, and that we probably aren't going to succeed in. We don't have the capacity to succeed in.
Michael, I think this conversation, I now have my nickname for you, the ever formidable Michael Cohen. I think
ever formidable. I like that.
I'm checking the clock, and I think we're about out of time.
I think we are.
So technical difficulties notwithstanding, I hope
Yeah.
the Blogging Heads team can patch it up, because it was a great time talking with you.
Absolutely, and I apologize to all the viewers here for if they were listening to my English bulldog barking in the background. But apparently, she missed me during this particular dialogue. So.
And on my end, it's the job site that's going on next door to me.
Right, exactly.
Okay, take care,
All
Michael.
right, thanks a lot, Judith. I'll take it easy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.